A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
This is Andrew McLennan. For 35 years, a Sydney man who had experienced a dramatic conversion to Christ would write with a piece of chalk eternity across the footpaths of Sydney. Well, a man by the name of Richard Attiah has produced a documentary about the life of Arthur Stace, and he joins us today to discuss this documentary. Richard, welcome.
Thanks for having us, Andrew.
Richard, it's a fairly well-known story in Australia amongst Christians especially, but what grabbed you about the story of Arthur Stace?
Mate, if I said to you 20 years ago, actually more than 20 years ago, do you remember the Millennium fireworks? Anyone who was around tend to say, yeah, I do actually. Yeah, do you remember the thing that happened right at the end? And I go, yeah, that word eternity, I still remember it. So a lot of people were remembering the eternity that appeared on the Harbour Bridge at the end of the Millennium fireworks. And this project for us started long before COVID, and we wanted to release it as part of the 20-year anniversary of what I think is Australia's best fireworks ever, which was, bookended with Eternity on the Bridge. And we wanted to look at how this word continued to resonate in the last 20 years, or now through the 24, 25 years, since it appeared on the bridge. And so that's what this documentary is about, looking at Arthur Stace's story, looking at how this word made its way into our narrative, into our history, and looking at how the word continues to be used today, so many years after its pinnacle of appearing on the bridge, and also at the Sydney 2000 Olympic Games as well.
Yeah, and obviously, so without COVID, this would have been released exactly 20 years after, but you had a slight hiccup there. But do you remember when you first saw that Eternity on the Sydney Harbour Bridge? Was that the first time you knew about the story, or were you already aware of it?
That was the first time I knew the story. I didn't even know the story. I just saw the word, and I thought, I wonder what that's all about. I had no idea. I was a bit younger back then. I was would have been late teens, I think, at the turn of the millennium. And yeah, the word eternity appeared, and then and I just remembered Eddie Maguire, who was hosting the Channel 9 coverage. He referenced this guy Arthur Stace, who wrote Eternity on the Streets for 35 years, and it still exists in one of the bells across Sydney. And that just went into my head, it went into my heart, and I just remembered it. And little did I know, 20 years later, I'd be the one with the absolute privilege of telling the eternity story, or at least the next chapter of the eternity story. Because there's been a lot of people who have told various iterations of the word eternity and how it came about, and told about its author, Arthur Stace, and how his life played out. And we wanted to come up with a story that showed honour to Arthur, showed honour to the people in Arthur's life, and also asked the question, where did the eternity story actually start? Did it start with Arthur, or were there some other characters involved? And then also look at the people who are using the eternity story today for whatever purpose and whatever means that they want to use it for.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing story, an unfolding story. But, some of our listeners weren't even, conscious or aware of what was going on in 2000. They're younger than you and I. Richard, so please just remind us, who is Arthur Stace?
Arthur Stace is, if you look through the history books, you'll miss his name. He won't appear. But this fella called Mr. Eternity does feature in Australian history, especially in our newspapers and in certain poems and short stories and so on. Arthur Stace was a fella who went off to World War I as a way of escaping a life of petty crime and alcoholism, being in and out of jail for all of his teens. World War I was on, and he had the opportunity to go and join the Australian Army. With the promise of regular pay, with the promise of a regular meal, and as a way of leaving behind this life, from a broken home, being in and out of jail, on and off the streets, addicted to the bottle. The army for him was an opportunity to make a fresh start. He goes off to World War I and serves as a stretcher bearer, and then comes back to Australia, goes back to the life that he knew, and then one day stumbles in to the Burton Street Baptist Tabernacle, goes along on the invitation. He'd been a Christian for a couple of years before that, and here's the sermon of a fellow called Reverend John Ridley talking about the echoes of eternity. And Arthur Stace was there, and he had been mentored by RBS Hammond over at Broadway in the Anglican Church for a couple of years. But the thing about John Ridley is he was a World War I veteran as well, and an ordained Baptist minister. who was doing an outreach at the Burton Street Baptist Tabernacle, which is now known as the Eternity Playhouse Theatre. And Arthur Stace went along, heard the Echoes of Eternity message, felt prompted by God to write Eternity on the streets of Sydney, and started doing it that very night and for the next 35 years, anonymously for a fair portion of that time as well. No one knew who he was. Arthur Stace is Mr. Eternity. That's the big mystery of who he is.
Yeah, so he was just some random writing eternity. But, you mentioned that he had a life of, petty crime and alcoholism. Can you go into more detail, like exactly what sort of things was he up to?
Well, when Arthur Stace was, sort of 10 or 11, unfortunately for him, his parents' marriage had broken down and he was being looked after by his sisters. And his sisters were involved with the underworld in Sydney, and they were involved in some criminal activities themselves, and they owned a couple of brothels. And Arthur Stace's job was to be a cockatoo, which was essentially a lookout. And so what that means is whenever the authorities come, when they hear the police sirens coming or they see the police coming up the road, then he yells out and says, "Police are coming," and then they sort of turn the place around and make it look like nothing has ever happened here before. And so that was what Arthur did throughout his teens. And being as part of that scene, alcohol and drugs were introduced to him, but alcohol really got a grip of him to the point where he was involved with petty crime, stealing things and trying to sort of hock them off to whoever, just so he could make enough money to go and buy another bottle of alcohol and drink some more. And so as a result of that, he had this life of petty crime that saw him, moving between the gutter and then the jail cell and then back to the gutter and back to the jail cell. And so that, unfortunately, that was his teenage life. And you sort of wish it was different. But just remember, this was a time before World War One, where there was a lot of uncertainty going on in Australia and around the world. Australia was just federated in 1901. So as a country, we were only, sort of 15 years old, if that, when Arthur was trying to find his way. Australia was trying, the Australian story was still being written, our formative years. And then we had this talk of this war from overseas. And so that was Arthur's world. He sort of got caught up in a whole bunch of uncertainty, and unfortunately crime was a big part of that.
Yeah, and this is before welfare, obviously, where people didn't get given money by the government. So if you wanted to feed a habit or even just survive, you had to work, didn't you? Or in his case, he just stole or did petty crime to feed that habit. But, you mentioned he went into that Baptist church, and that's where God really called him to write Eternity. But where and how did he get saved?
Well, a couple of years prior, Arthur Stace was, his stomping ground was Sydney, right? Like the CBD, George Street, Elizabeth Street, if anyone knows where Hyde Park is. That was where he would spend most of his time, sort of begging for money or searching for food or whatever. But this one particular time, he was making his way back to Redfern, and then they went past St. Barney's Church on Broadway, and he saw a sign which basically invited all these homeless men in, and you could get a cup of tea and a rock cake on the proviso that you would put up with a sermon from a fellow called R.B.S. Hammond. And Arthur Stace was hungry and he was cold, and so with his mates, he stumbles into St. Barnabas Church and listens to R.B.S. Hammond talking about the gospel and how the gospel can turn people's lives around. And that was the beginning of Arthur's faith journey. As the story goes, after that night, having met Hammond and I guess the outreach team, and having had a cup of tea and something in his belly, he's walking across Uni Park, finds a fig tree, falls to his knees, and then gives his life to Christ. And the story goes that he has never had a drop of alcohol since that day. So it's quite remarkable. It
is remarkable, and I think it should encourage all of us that, we most of us go to church on Sunday, and maybe we're involved in church, setting up or ushering or running the kids' church or doing the music, and you just never know, do you, who's going to wander into your service and receive Christ, and not just receive Christ, but go on to have such an impact on so many people. And here we are today talking about this man who was alive more than 100 years ago, and his story continues, and that's what you've called this, haven't you, the Echo of Arthur Stace.
Yeah, absolutely. So Arthur did most of his writing in chalk, so we called it Written in Chalk. And then the Echo of Arthur Stace, here's a fella who He's a fellow who was so captivated by the concept of eternity. And, Reverend John Ridley deserves a lot of credit for this, because he was the one who, when he was in his room or wherever he writes sermons, who fell on his knees and obediently wrote the Echoes of Eternity sermon, and then delivered the Echoes of Eternity sermon on that night. But Arthur was so moved, and as the story goes, Reverend John Ridley, towards the end of his sermon, under his breath, uttered the words, "If only I could shout it across our city, eternity across our city." Now, Arthur Stace took those words, and he didn't shout it with his voice, but he shouted it with a piece of chalk for a very long time, to the point where it became his identity. It became his mantra, if you will. And because he wasn't known, the figure of Mr. Eternity was a mystery. And so because of that, the newspapers started writing about it. It was highly visual. In our film, we speak with a historian who says Arthur Stace was like Batman, and the eternity was like his bat signal, but it was on the ground instead of up in the sky, you know? And it was one of those things where it was like, who is this eternity person? It's a man. Where does he come from? No one knew. And so people were talking about eternity long before Arthur Stace was discovered, and long after Reverend John Ridley delivered the sermon.
Amazing. And, isn't it amazing that Reverend, his cry was, could it be shouted across the whole city? And, many, many years later it wasn't it, when the Sydney fireworks were on, like you said, in the Olympics, and also the end of the millennium, that it was shouted across the city. It's such an encouraging story, isn't it?
Oh, you know what? The story of obedience really comes through to me, and it's something that I tried to capture in the film. We did our best. Obedience and grace, these two things that really captured grace first and then obedience, was a sort of a couple of mantras in Arthur's life. And this whole idea of shouting it across the city, look, Arthur did a great job. He passed away in the late 60s. And, right up from 1932 to 1967, Arthur was just writing eternity on the streets. The story got picked up, as I said, by the newspapers. And then, in the 50s and 60s, it started getting picked up by various artists, musicians and poets and writers and so on. And then it gets picked up by this fellow called Martin Sharp, who ends up coming to Christ. I wouldn't say necessarily just because of the eternity story, but it's certainly part of Martin's story. Martin started putting it on tea towels and Haymarket signs in Sydney and a whole bunch of stuff. And then it ends up on, and so that was sort of part of Across Sydney. But in our film, we reference eternity appearing in the opening ceremony of the Sydney Olympic Games. And it only appears for a couple of seconds, but in the distance there's a screen in the opening ceremony, and it says Eternity in Sydney, and then it appears in a couple of different languages after that. Now, when I saw that, it's one of those things where you work on these films, sometimes you miss things, and it's not until you sort of sit back as a viewer and you start appreciating some of the things that, some of the other team members or maybe even God does in the production process. When I saw eternity translated in a couple of different languages, I thought, man, oh man, I never really appreciated that, John Ridley was talking about yelling it across or sharing it across the city, but here we are in 2000 sharing it with the world. Yeah. The world was watching the Sydney Olympic Games, and there we had in the opening ceremony, which is, the opening ceremonies are by and large the largest viewing audience in the world on television, and eternity was emblazoned on the screens and interpreted in a couple of different languages. I just think that's worth celebrating.
It actually is, Richard. It's amazing. It's amazing. And I want to say to you, thank you so much for producing this documentary. And this is an important part of Australian Christian history. So well done, Richard. Well done. Now, if people want to watch this documentary or learn more about it, there's a website, isn't there? writteninChalk.com. Richard, I want to thank you so much, A, for making the documentary, and B, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. And just another little plug. It is available through Coorong.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.